cold iron bit into Jedediah's palm as he steadied the axe. He stood on the granite shoulder of Whisperwind Ridge, his small cabin a promise of warmth behind him. He needed to split enough firewood to outlast the coming snowstorm, a task he measured in days, not hours. But the wind carried a new sound, the thin cry of a voice where no voice should be. Answering that call meant breaking a 5-year silence and letting the world he fled find him again. He drove the axe into the chopping block and left it there, a silent promise to return. The sound came again, clearer this time, a name carried on the wind. It was a young voice strained with effort and fear. Jedediah moved through the familiar pines, his boots making little sound on the carpet of fallen needles. He crested a small rise and looked down into a shallow ravine where a narrow creek tumbled over stones. A young woman was kneeling beside a boy who sat with his back against a fallen log, his legs stretched out at an awkward angle. Their pack mule stood nearby, favoring its left foreleg, its head hanging low. They were dressed for travel, but not for the kind of cold that was rolling down from the peaks. The woman's coat was thin, the boy's boots worn through at the toe. He saw the desperation in the set of her shoulders, the way she kept looking at the sky. The clouds were the color of a fresh bruise, thick and low. Anyone who knows the mountains understands that first sign of a real storm. He made his way down the slope, deliberately making enough noise so he would not startle them. The woman looked up, her eyes wide, her hand moving to a small knife at her belt. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands held open and away from his body. "The storm will be here before sundown," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You need shelter." She stayed on her feet, a silent guardian over the boy. Her name was Elara, and the boy was her brother, Finn. He had slipped on wet rock, his ankle now swollen and useless. Their goal had been a small town called Providence Creek, another 2 days' walk, but that was before Finn's injury and the mule going lame. She explained their situation in clipped, proud sentences, refusing to ask for help directly, but letting the facts speak for themselves. Jedediah listened, his gaze moving from their worn gear to the darkening sky. He saw the map she held clutched in her hand. The map was drawn on old linen, the ink faded but the lines precise, marking a trail he had never seen used. He knew then they were not merely lost. They were following a dream that was about to be swallowed by a nightmare. He felt the old resistance, the deep-seated urge to turn away, to retreat to the safety of his solitude. But he also saw the trust in the boy's eyes, a simple, unnerving faith that an adult would know what to do. The first flake of snow landed on his sleeve, a perfect 6-pointed star that melted almost instantly. It was a choice he did not want, but a choice that had already been made by the mountain itself. "My cabin is a half-hour from here," he said. "You can stay until the storm passes." She hesitated for only a moment, then gave a sharp, grateful nod. Getting Finn up the slope was a slow and painful process. Jedediah fashioned a crude crutch from a sturdy branch, and with Elara on one side and the crutch on the other, the boy managed to hobble, his face pale with pain. The mule followed, limping but obedient. The wind was rising now, its voice a low moan through the pines. Jedediah's cabin was small but solid, built of thick logs he had felled and shaped himself. A thin curl of smoke still rose from the stone chimney, a testament to the fire he had banked that morning. Inside, the single room was spare and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a bed built into the opposite corner. A sturdy table, 2 chairs, and shelves filled with neatly stacked supplies completed the space. It was a place built for one person, a fortress against the world. He settled Finn in a chair by the hearth, then went to work building up the fire. The warmth began to push back the encroaching chill, and the small space filled with the scent of pine smoke and security. Elara moved quietly, tending to her brother's ankle with a practiced gentleness, her movements efficient and capable. Jedediah watched her, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. It had been years since another person had shared this space, years since he had heard any voice but his own and the wind's. He had not realized how loud the silence had become. He offered them stew from a pot that was always simmering on the hearth, and they ate with the quiet intensity of the truly hungry. The storm arrived just after dark, a wall of wind and snow that shook the cabin. Anyone listening in the dark feels the stove warmth hold steady. As Elara looked around the small, safe room, she finally allowed herself to relax. She pulled a worn leather book from her pack. The journal's leather was cracked, but inside the survey notes were clear, filled with numbers and angles. "This belonged to our father," she said. "He was a surveyor. He marked a claim in these mountains years ago, a place he said was special. We came to find it." Jedediah took the journal she offered, his hand surprisingly steady. He opened it, and the familiar script of a surveyor's log, the precise numbers and careful diagrams, felt like a ghost from another life. He recognized the notation style, the way the elevations were marked. Then he saw the name signed at the bottom of a page, a name he had not seen in 5 long years. It was the name of the man who had died on his watch, the man whose memory had driven him into this self-imposed exile. The journal belonged to his former partner. He closed the book slowly, his face an unreadable mask. The mountain had not just sent him strangers, it had sent him the past he could not outrun. He knew he had to help them now, not just from kindness, but from a debt he could never truly repay. The blizzard raged for 3 days, burying the world in a deep blanket of white. Inside the cabin, a strange, quiet routine took hold. Jedediah, Ilara, and Finn existed in the small space like planets in a tiny solar system, each moving in their own orbit but constantly aware of the others. Jedediah taught Finn how to carve a simple wooden bird with his knife. The boy's focus on the small task, a welcome distraction from the pain in his ankle. Ilara proved to be endlessly resourceful, mending their worn clothes with a small sewing kit from her pack and organizing Jedediah's supplies with a quiet efficiency that both impressed and unsettled him. In the evenings, she would read aloud from her father's journal. She skipped over the dense pages of survey data, focusing instead on the personal entries. Her father wrote of the beauty of the high country, of his dream of building a life there, a place of peace and prosperity for his children. Jedediah listened, the words painting a portrait of the man he had known, but from a perspective he had never considered. He had only known his partner as a surveyor, a man of numbers and lines. He had never known him as a father, as a dreamer. The pages of the journal contained more than just hope. Ilara found a folded document tucked into a leather flap at the back. It was a land deed, properly filed and stamped. The land deed carries an old stamp from the territorial office, a mark of official record. It described a parcel of 160 acres, defined by stone markers and sight lines to specific peaks. "The claim is ours legally," Ilara said, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and relief. "All we have to do is find it and live on it." Jedediah studied the deed, then compared it to the corresponding entry in the journal. He saw what she did not. The journal described the final corner marker as a large, split boulder on the edge of Blue Creek. The deed, however, listed the final marker as an iron survey pin. It was a small discrepancy, but in the world of surveying, small discrepancies could mean the difference between a valid claim and a worthless piece of paper. He didn't mention it to her. There was no sense in adding to her worries while they were trapped by the storm. He would investigate the issue himself once the weather cleared. This was his world, the world of lines and boundaries, and he understood its unforgiving rules. He felt the weight of his old life settling on his shoulders, a familiar burden he had thought he'd shrugged off forever. One person listening can hear the quiet scratch of a pen on paper, a sound of order against the chaos outside. The storm had revealed a flaw not just in the landscape, but in the very foundation of their hopes. He knew he couldn't let them face this uncertainty alone. The story of their future was tied to a mistake made in his past, and he was the only one who could read the map of what went wrong. On the 4th morning, they woke to a world of blinding white and profound silence. The storm had broken, leaving behind a landscape transformed and purified. The snow was deep, easily 4 feet in the clearings, and drifted much higher against the trees. Travel would be impossible for days, perhaps weeks, for anyone without the right gear. Jedediah had the right gear. He had spent years preparing for this kind of isolation. He had snowshoes he had crafted from ash wood and rawhide, and he knew how to read the subtle signs of the snowpack, where it was stable and where it might hide a deep drift or a covered crevasse. He told Ilara and Finn he was going out to check his trap lines. It was only a partial truth. His real purpose was to scout a safe path toward the area marked on their map, the place called Sutter's Claim. He needed to see the land for himself, to understand the discrepancy between the journal and the deed. He moved through the hushed forest, the only sounds the soft crunch of his snowshoes and his own steady breathing. The world was pristine, the snow a clean page on which no story had yet been written. He felt a sense of peace that had been absent during the days of forced company in the cabin. Yet the silence was different now. It was no longer a comforting shield, but an empty space that he now noticed. After several hours of steady climbing, he reached the ridge that overlooked the valley described in the journal. What he saw below stopped him in his tracks. The valley was there, a perfect bowl of white nestled between three peaks. Blue Creek carved a dark, winding line through its center. But where Ilara's father had described a meadow of wildflowers and a stand of old-growth pine, Jedediah saw a scene of devastation. A massive rock slide had torn down the western slope of the valley, bearing a huge section under tons of rock and debris. The slide was old from the previous spring by the look of the few hardy saplings already poking through the rubble. It had completely obliterated the area where the journal indicated the split boulder should be. The primary marker for their claim was gone, buried under a mountain of stone. Anyone who has seen their hopes crushed knows the feeling in that moment. There was no easy solution to this. Without that corner marker, their claim was legally adrift, its boundaries undefined and open to challenge. He turned back toward the cabin, the heavy knowledge settling in his gut. He had thought the problem was a simple clerical error on a piece of paper, but the mountain had presented a far greater challenge, one that could not be fixed with a pen. He didn't tell them the full extent of what he had discovered. He simply said that the snow was too deep to travel safely and that the Western Valley had suffered a rock slide. He framed it as a delay, not a disaster, but he could see the worry clouding Ilara's eyes. She was intelligent and perceptive, and she knew he was holding something back. The days settled into a new rhythm, one of waiting. The time was not idle, however. Jedediah, recognizing that their survival depended on more than just his own stored provisions, began teaching them the skills of the mountains. He showed Finn how to set simple snares for rabbits and squirrels along the edge of the woods. He took Ilara with him to identify edible plants that still clung to life beneath the snow on south-facing slopes. He was a patient and methodical teacher, explaining the principles behind each task rather than just the actions. He spoke of listening to the land, of understanding its patterns as a way of life. She was a quick study, her hands nimble and her mind sharp. She absorbed every lesson, her determination a quiet fire that Jedediah found himself admiring. During one of these lessons, while digging for the starchy roots of a wild lily, her shovel struck something hard. It wasn't a rock. It was a wooden crate, buried just under the surface of the soil. Together, they cleared the snow and frozen dirt. The crate was old and heavy, its wood weathered but still solid. On its side was a stenciled mark. The crate bears a mine mark that matches the seal from the territorial capital, a symbol for the Consolidated Mining Company. Inside, they found not gold or silver, but something far more valuable for their immediate needs. It was a cache of surveyor's tools, a compass, a heavy chain for measuring distance, and several iron pins, identical to the one described in the deed. "Why would this be here?" Ilara asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "This is miles from the claim." It was a good question, and Jedediah didn't have an immediate answer. But as he examined the contents, he noticed something else. Tucked into a leather pouch with the compass was a small, folded piece of oilcloth. He carefully unfolded it. It was a second map, a preliminary sketch of the valley. This map showed the split boulder, but it also had a second point marked with a cross and the words alternate pin set. The location was on the opposite side of the creek, on higher ground, safe from any potential rock slide. A flicker of understanding, a surveyor's intuition, sparked in his mind. Her father had been thorough. He had recognized the instability of the western slope and had set a backup marker, a fail-safe to protect his claim. He had recorded the official marker as the boulder for the deed filing, as it was the more prominent landmark, but he had taken precautions. This was the work of a careful, professional man. The only person listening knows the relief that comes with a second chance. The iron pin described in the deed was not a mistake. It was a solution. The discovery of the cache changed everything. It gave them a tangible goal and a clear path forward. The lost boulder no longer mattered if they could find the alternate iron pin. With the new map and a clear objective, The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from one of passive waiting to active preparation. Jedediah's initial reluctance to get involved had completely evaporated, replaced by a focused sense of purpose. He was a surveyor again, with a problem to solve. The challenge energized him in a way he had not felt in years. He spent the evenings with Alara and Finn, planning their route to the valley. He used the new map and his own knowledge of the terrain to plot a course that would be safe and efficient, even with the deep snow. He taught them how to read the topography, to understand how the lines on the map translated to the real world of ridges, valleys, and streams. It was clear to Alara that this was the man he used to be, confident and in his element. She saw a passion in him that his quiet, solitary life had kept hidden. Finn, his ankle now mostly healed, was an eager student. He absorbed the lessons on navigation and survival, his youthful energy a welcome addition to their small group. He saw Jedediah not as a hermit or a stranger, but as a mentor, a figure of strength and knowledge in a world that had been frightening and uncertain. After a week of planning and waiting for the snow to settle and firm up, they were ready. They packed supplies for a 3-day journey, loading the now healed mule with the bulk of their gear. Jedediah left his cabin with a strange sense of reluctance. It had been his sanctuary for 5 years, but now leaving it felt like leaving a part of himself behind to venture back into a world of connection and complication. The journey was arduous. They moved slowly, with Jedediah breaking trail on his snowshoes, the others following in the compacted path. The silence of the winter landscape was immense, broken only by the squeak of their boots on the snow and the occasional call of a raven. On the second day they reached the valley. It was even more imposing in person than it had been from the ridge. The scale of the rock slide was immense, a raw scar on the face of the mountain. Alara stared at the devastation, her face a mixture of awe and dismay. So much of what her father had described in his journal was simply gone. According to the sketch map, the alternate marker was on a wooded knoll on the far side of the frozen creek. They made camp in a sheltered stand of pines and the next morning began their search. Finding a single iron pin in 160 acres of snow-covered wilderness was a daunting task. Jedediah used the surveyor's compass and his own practiced eye to narrow the search area. He took sight lines from the peaks mentioned in the journal, creating intersecting lines that should, in theory, lead them to the marker. They spent the entire day searching, digging through the snow wherever the compass and sight lines suggested the pin might be. By late afternoon, with the sun sinking toward the peaks, they had found nothing. Frustration began to set in. Finn was tired, his initial enthusiasm worn down by the fruitless labor. Alara remained determined, but Jedediah could see the strain on her face. Anyone who has searched for something vital understands the creeping dread of failure. He called a halt as dusk began to fall. They would try again in the morning. That night, as they sat around a small campfire, a sense of defeat hung in the air. Alara was quiet, staring into the flames. "What if we can't find it?" she asked softly. "What if it's not here?" "It's here," Jedediah said with more confidence than he felt. "Your father was a good surveyor. He wouldn't have made a mistake in his notes." Later that night, unable to sleep, Jedediah sat with the journal and the maps, studying them by the light of the dying fire. He reread the entries, searching for a clue he might have missed. He found it in a seemingly unrelated passage where Alara's father described his admiration for the ancient bristlecone pines, trees that found purchase on the highest, most windswept ridges. He wrote, "They align themselves with the wind, their trunks a living compass." A thought struck Jedediah, a leap of intuition born from his own deep knowledge of the mountains. He went to the edge of their camp and looked up at the knoll. A handful of ancient gnarled trees stood silhouetted against the starry sky, their branches all swept in one direction by the prevailing wind. The next morning he led them not to where the compass pointed, but to the small grove of bristlecone pines. He explained his theory that her father, a man who saw patterns in nature, might have used one of the trees as a final reference point. They began to search around the base of the largest, most ancient-looking pine. Within minutes, Finn's shovel struck metal with a sharp clang. They frantically cleared the snow, their hearts pounding. There it was, an iron pin driven deep into the ground, its top slightly mushroomed from the force of the hammer that had set it years ago. They had found their anchor in the world. The discovery of the survey pin was a moment of pure triumph. For Finn, it was the successful end of a great adventure. For Ilara, it was the validation of her father's dream and the reward for her own unwavering faith. For Jedediah, it was the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved, a puzzle put right. But their work was not yet done. A single marker was not enough to secure the claim. They needed to find the other three corners to establish the full boundary. Over the next week, they fell into the rhythm of a survey crew. Jedediah, using the tools from the cache and the notes in the journal, guided them. He taught Ilara how to use the surveyor's chain, a heavy, precise instrument for measuring distance. He showed Finn how to blaze trees to mark a clear line of sight through the woods. It was hard, meticulous work. They battled deep snow, thick underbrush, and the biting winter cold. But with each corner they located, each boundary line they marked, the abstract shape on the map became a real and tangible place. It became their land. They found the remains of a small cabin near the center of the claim, just as the journal described. It was mostly collapsed, its roof caved in by snow, but the stone foundation was solid. This would be their starting point. As they worked, Jedediah saw the land through the eyes of Ilara's father. He understood why he had chosen this place. It was sheltered from the worst of the winds, had a reliable source of water from the creek, and the soil in the areas untouched by the rock slide was dark and rich. It was a place where a family could put down roots. The final marker was located on the far side of the valley, near the edge of the official town limits of Providence Creek. As they finished their work, they saw a figure on horseback approaching from the town. The man was dressed in the practical clothes of a rancher, but he sat his horse with an air of authority. He introduced himself as Marcus Thorne, the town's land agent and mayor. He had seen their smoke and had come to investigate. "I haven't seen anyone working this parcel in years," he said, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Most folks believe it's cursed since the slide." Ilara stepped forward, holding the deed in her father's journal. "This is the Sutter claim," she said, her voice clear and steady. "We are his children, and we've come to take possession of our inheritance." Thorne looked at the documents, then at the freshly blazed property lines. The trading post ledger shows 3 names from last winter, who tried to settle here and gave up. He seemed skeptical. "To be official, this claim needs to be refiled at my office in town. The original survey is over a decade old. Given the rock slide, the boundaries will need to be verified. The law requires a new survey, signed and sealed by a licensed territorial surveyor." His words landed like stones. They had done all this work, had overcome every obstacle the mountain had thrown at them, only to be faced with a wall of bureaucracy. They knew they could not afford to hire a surveyor. And even if they could, finding one to come up into the high country in the middle of winter would be impossible. Anyone listening knows the frustration of a finish line that suddenly moves farther away. The solution to their problem was standing right next to them, but he was a man who had left that life behind. Jedediah looked at the land they had just measured, at the hope in Ilara's eyes and the quiet trust in Finn's. He knew what he had to do. He would have to go to Providence Creek and reclaim the identity he had abandoned. The silence that followed Marcus Thorne's pronouncement was heavy. Ilara's face fell, the triumph of the past week draining away to be replaced by a familiar look of weary resignation. Finn kicked at a patch of snow, his youthful optimism finally failing him. Jedediah felt the weight of their disappointment as if it were his own. He had come to care for these two, for their quiet courage and their fierce dedication to their father's dream. He could not let it end here. "I am a licensed surveyor," Jedediah said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "My name is Jedediah Stone. My license is filed with the territorial office in the capital. I can perform the survey and sign the documents." Thorne's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He looked from Jedediah's weathered face and mountain clothes to the professional way he had marked the boundary lines. "Jedediah Stone," he repeated slowly, as if testing the name. "I remember that name." "You did some." Jedediah gave a single, slow nod. The name felt like a borrowed coat, one he had not worn in a very long time. He could feel the fit of it, the familiar weight on his shoulders. "Rumors of my demise were inaccurate," he said, his voice a low rumble. The land agent, Thorne, studied him for a long moment, his sharp eyes taking in the worn buckskins, the untrimmed beard, the profound stillness that clung to Jedediah like mountain frost. Then a smile touched his lips, but it did not reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who has just found a useful tool. Well, Jedediah Stone, this does change things. A man with your reputation. Of course, the claim will still need a new plat map filed. The original survey is old, and the rock slide has changed the landscape considerably. The law is the law. His tone was smooth, reasonable. It was the kind of reasonableness that hid sharp edges. There was a pause, a quiet moment where the future of the valley hung in the balance. Elara looked at Jedediah, her expression a mixture of hope and a deep, intuitive caution. She had learned to read the silences in the mountains, and this silence felt wrong. "I can draw the map," Jedediah said. "I have the field notes. The boundaries are confirmed." Thorn leaned back in his saddle, one hand resting on his thigh. "That's excellent, but there is another small matter. A formality, you understand." He pulled a folded paper from an inside pocket of his coat. It was a notice from the territorial office, already weathered as if it had made a long journey. A matter of delinquent taxes on the Sutter parcel, unpaid for the last 3 years. According to this, the grace period expires at noon, 3 days from now. After that, the land reverts to the territory for public auction. The words fell into the cold air like stones into a deep well. Elara's face went pale. Taxes. It was a detail from a world they had left behind, a world of clerks and ledgers that had followed them into the wilderness. "We have no money," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Thorn gave a sympathetic shrug. "A real shame. Such a promising piece of land. I would, of course, be willing to acquire the debt myself. And the deed, I could offer you enough to get you and the boy safely back to civilization." It was not an offer of help. It was the move of a predator closing in. He had known about the taxes all along. He had let them do the hard work of finding and marking the claim, only to snatch it away at the last moment with a piece of paper. Jedediah looked from Thorn's predatory smile to Elara's stricken face. He saw the flicker of despair in her eyes, the crushing weight of a dream turning to dust. In that moment, something shifted inside him. For 5 years, he had lived with a debt to a dead man. Now he felt a new responsibility, a fierce, protective duty to the living. His solitude had been a shield against pain, but he saw now it had also been a barrier to purpose. This man will not have this land, he thought. The decision was not made of logic or reason. It was an instinct, as deep and solid as the granite of the peaks around them. "I will handle it," Jedediah said, his gaze locked on Thorn. He turned to Elara. "Go back to the camp. Keep working on the cabin. Trust me." She searched his face, seeing not a hermit or a stranger, but the surveyor who had led them through the snow, the man who had taught her brother to carve a bird. She saw a quiet strength she had come to rely on. She nodded once, a gesture of absolute faith, before turning to lead Finn and the mule back toward their fragile new home. Jedediah watched them go, then turned his attention back to the land agent. "We will meet in your office in Providence Creek." 3 days. Thorn's smile widened. He believed he had already won. "I look forward to it, Stone." He spurred his horse and rode toward town, leaving Jedediah alone with the freshly blazed trees and an impossible deadline. Jedediah did not go to town. He went back to the small camp, the weight of his promise settling upon him. He had no money to pay the taxes. His small cache of coins at his own cabin was a pittance, not nearly enough to satisfy the territorial government. He could not fight Thorn with wealth. He would have to fight him with knowledge. That evening, by the light of a small fire, he sat with Elara's father's journal. He was not looking for survey notes this time. He was searching for a ghost, a detail, a single fact that could change the equation. Elara sat across from him, mending one of Finn's shirts, her silence a comforting presence. She did not ask him his plan. Her trust was a gift, and it fueled his resolve. He read deep into the night, the pages filled with the familiar language of his trade. Elevations, declinations, chain measurements. Then he found it. Tucked into the back of the journal was a section of notes that were not about the claim itself. They were observations, notes on the geology of the region, copied from an older source. Her father had been meticulous, a true student of the land. He had transcribed a passage from the original Territorial Geological Survey conducted decades earlier. The passage described a significant vein of graphite running deep beneath the western ridge of the valley. It was considered too difficult to access, too remote to be of commercial value at the time, but the original survey had made one crucial addendum. To encourage settlement, the territory had granted full and permanent mineral rights to any homesteader who successfully filed a claim on a parcel containing a designated geological feature. Jedediah's heart began to beat faster. A claim with mineral rights was not subject to the same tax laws. It was a different class of property altogether. Thorne was trying to seize a simple homestead claim. If Jedediah could prove the Sutter claim qualified for its mineral rights, Thorne's tax lien might be worthless. But to do that, he needed more than a note in a journal. He needed proof. He needed to find the original marker from that first geological survey, a marker that had likely not been seen by human eyes in 50 years. The journal entry described the marker simply: a brass cap set in a granite outcrop at the head of Blue Creek, where the water emerged from the mountain. It was miles away in the most rugged and inaccessible part of the valley, an area buried under the deepest snows. He had 2 days. He explained the plan to Alara the next morning, the steam from their mugs of chicory coffee rising in the frigid air. "It is a long shot," he told her. "This marker may not even exist anymore." She listened intently, her eyes never leaving his. "We will find it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. They left Finn at the camp with enough food and wood for the day and strict instructions to stay close. The journey to the head of the valley was brutal. Jedediah broke trail on his snowshoes, his body remembering the familiar burn of climbing through deep powder. Alara followed, her smaller frame fighting for every step, but her determination never wavered. They moved through a silent world of white, the only sounds their own labored breathing and the rhythmic crunch of the snow. They reached the head of the valley late in the afternoon. It was a vast frozen amphitheater of rock and ice. The creek disappeared into a jumble of massive boulders and snowdrifts 20 feet deep. Finding a single brass cap here seemed impossible. "We start where the journal says," Jedediah said, pointing toward a prominent granite cliff face. He took out his compass, trying to triangulate from the faint descriptions in the old notes. For hours they searched, digging into the snowpack with their shovels, their hope dwindling with the fading light. The wind picked up, a low, mournful howl that promised a bitterly cold night. They were exhausted, chilled to the bone, and had found nothing. Alara leaned against a snow-covered boulder, her shoulders slumping. "Maybe it's not here," she said, her voice thin against the wind. "Maybe the snow took it, or a slide." Jedediah looked at her, at the raw determination that had carried her across mountains, at the fierce hope she held for her brother. He would not let that hope die here. "Your father was a good surveyor," he said, his own words from a week ago coming back to him. He found these notes. He believed they were important. He chose this valley for a reason. Let's think like he did. A surveyor doesn't just look at the ground. He looks at the whole landscape. He scanned the cliff face, the patterns of the rock, the way the snow had drifted. He noticed something he hadn't seen before, a faint discoloration in the rock, a dark streak running vertically down the cliff, almost like a shadow. It was a seam of harder rock, one that would have been noted by a geologist. And at the base of that seam, almost completely hidden by a deep drift, was a small, flat ledge, a place sheltered from the worst of the falling snow. "It has to be there," he said, a surge of adrenaline cutting through his exhaustion. He moved toward the ledge, his snowshoes finding purchase on the steep slope. He began to dig, not frantically, but with a surveyor's precision, clearing the snow away layer by layer. Alara joined him, their shovels moving in a desperate, rhythmic harmony, and then his shovel struck something that was not rock. It was the solid, unyielding ring of metal. Working together, they cleared the last of the snow. There it was, covered in a patina of green verdigris, but unmistakable. A brass disc, 4 inches in diameter, set flush into the granite. Stamped into its surface were the words U.S. Territorial Geological Survey and a date from 50 years prior. It was the proof they needed. They had won. The next day, just before noon, Jedediah walked into the land office in Providence Creek. The room was warm, smelling of dry paper and Thorne's cigar smoke. The land agent sat behind his desk, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. A few local ranchers, friends of Thorne's, were present to witness the transaction. They looked at Jedediah with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You're cutting it close, Stone," Thorne said, gesturing to the clock on the wall. "Do you have the money?" Jedediah said nothing. He walked to the desk and unrolled a piece of drafting paper. It was not a plat map of the homestead claim. It was a new map, one he had stayed up all night drawing by the light of the fire. It showed the Sutter claim, but it also showed the location of the geological survey marker in the clear path of the graphite vein running directly beneath the property. Beside the map, he placed Ilara's father's journal, open to the page with the transcribed notes. And finally, he placed a rubbing he had taken of the brass marker, the raised letters and date clearly visible on the thin paper. "According to the Territorial Land Act of '47, he said, his voice calm and steady, "any claim filed on a parcel containing a designated geological feature is granted full and indivisible mineral rights. Such claims are not subject to standard property tax liens. The Sutter claim is, and has always been, a mineral claim. Your lien is invalid, Marcus." The silence in the room was absolute. Thorne's face went from smug to confused to a dark, mottled red. He stared at the map, at the rubbing, at the calm, unyielding man standing before him. The ranchers shifted uncomfortably. They were hard men, but they understood the difference between a sharp business deal and outright theft. They were witnessing the latter being exposed. "This is preposterous," Thorne sputtered. "An old marker. It means nothing." "The law is quite clear," Jedediah countered. He tapped a paragraph he had copied onto the map from the territorial statutes. "I am a licensed surveyor," he continued, his voice resonating with an authority he had not felt in years. "I am attesting with my name and my seal that this claim meets all legal requirements for a mineral patent. I will be filing this map with the territorial office in the capital. If you wish to challenge it, you will be challenging them, and you will be investigated for attempting to fraudulently seize a vested mineral claim." He had laid his trap perfectly. Thorne was beaten. The land agent looked at the faces of the other men in the room, and he saw no support. He saw only the cold judgment of a community that had just seen his true character. He deflated, the bluster draining out of him, leaving only a sour, defeated old man. Jedediah rolled up his map and turned to leave. He had done what he came to do. He had honored his debt not by paying money, but by using the skill that had once been his identity. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Thorne. "One more thing. This town needs a land agent who actually serves the people. I will be putting my name forward for the position." He did not ride back to his cabin on the Whisperwind Ridge. He rode back to the valley, to the half-finished cabin that was beginning to look like a home. He found Ilara and Finn splitting firewood, the steady rhythm of the axe a song of persistence. Ilara looked up as he approached, her face questioning, hopeful. He dismounted and walked toward her. He did not hand her a deed. He handed her the rubbing of the brass marker. "It is yours," he said. "All of it. The land, the trees, what is beneath it. It is all yours. For good." She took the paper, her fingers tracing the faint indentations. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. A smile that felt like the first day of spring after a long, hard winter. He looked at the cabin, at the work that still needed to be done. The north wall needed a new foundation. The roof needed to be finished before the next snow. They would need to clear a field come spring, build a proper barn. There was a lifetime of work here. He had come to these mountains seeking an ending, a place to let his old life die. He had not expected to find a beginning. "I thought I might stay for a while," he said, his voice quiet. "This foundation won't set itself." Ilara met his gaze. In her eyes he saw not gratitude but partnership, a shared understanding of the hard work ahead and the quiet joy of building something together. "Welcome home, Jedediah," she said. He picked up the axe, its familiar weight a comfort in his hand. The iron was cold, but he knew that, with work and time and a little bit of shared warmth, it would build a future.